Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I was really looking forward to being here 6 days ago, and then received an email from Jerry saying that Richard Gibbons was ill and Richard and I were going to co-present. My understanding of that was that I was going to be the Ed McMahon to Richard's Johnny Carson, or the Alfred to his Batman. And speaking forth after Jerry and Laura and John is in itself an intimidating thing. So to bat cleanup when you're the fourth position, that's what you're supposed to. Richard would have done a great job at that. He'd be the Babe Ruth, and I was going to be the bat boy carrying the Louisville Slugger bat to him. But so he's out of commission. The managers were looking for someone to sub for him, and there was nobody on the bench, so they called the bat boy in, and so here we are. So I hope I've suitably dimmed your expectations so that now we can move forward. The goal of this time is to talk together about confessing the creeds faithfully, and we're going to focus particularly on our ECO members here because this is a specifically ECO discussion. Now that doesn't let fellowship folks off the hook. Our hope is that you will see this as a case study so that were you trying to build from the ground up a new denominational and have it from the start be infused with Reformed creeds and confessions, be theologically alive, how would you go about that? That's what we want to ask and have you follow up with. I want to go back to what Jerry said in his talk and has said numerous times before. The goal of ECO is to get the gospel out, to get it right, and to get it deeply within. I think, though, I would change the order if we're talking about foundational priorities. We need first to get the gospel right, then to get it deeply within, so that we can adequately go out into the world and get it out. I did not grow up in the fold of the Christian faith. I was not blessed like Laura to from the cradle to have Calvin read to me by my parents in the Latin. Was it's not blessed like Jerry to be baptized as an infant in a Geneva gown. I just didn't come to Christ until I was in my 20th year of life. And I did not learn about the Book of Confessions until I had been a Christian for 3 years and was attending Fuller, and discovered that my vision of what God was doing in my life was not the same as his. I'd signed up for the marriage and family counseling program at Fuller, and then found myself before the end of the first year shifting to the regular MDiv track. I never considered the possibility of being a pastor, so I never really paid attention to denominations. I knew very little about denominations. I was a Presbyterian simply because I was a Christian at Stanford University, and I was attending Menlo Park Press. That was where God made me feel at home. And so I joined there, and so I backed into being a Presbyterian by God's prevenient grace, and enjoyed being in that church. Well, when I started to think about where does God want me to be in the family of faith, since I knew at least a tiny bit about Presbyterianism, UPC USA at that time, I thought I should find out more. I learned that there was such a thing called Book of Confessions. And so I got a hold of a copy and opened it one day and started to read. And it was that proverbial trying to drink from the fire hydrant experience. I was blown away. Figuratively speaking, by that stream of strong theology. I must have done 100 back rolls through that stream until I came to a stop and thought, this is powerful stuff. And I came back and started reading and found my delight in these great creeds and confessions of the faith that I knew nothing about up until then. And I thought to myself, as I got through with the book of Confessions, knowing a little bit about Presbyterian polity, and I thought I could swallow that, any church that believes these things must be a good place to land. So I decided I'd become Presbyterian. Now, I neglected to ask, and nobody ever told me that the Presbyterians didn't really believe these things, that we have them in a book, but they don't impact our denominational life all that much. I discovered that the gospel message that we're called to get right is something that, because of our lack of theological investigation and integrity, we often get wrong. As we find that our churches are proclaiming an attenuated gospel, whether it's on the conservative wing or on the liberal wing. For conservatives, it's often a gospel of me. Christ came for me. So you have you have people who preach messages, or people who say, Jesus came to this world to bless my marriage so that I could have the best sex I could ever dream of. Jesus came to lay out for his people 7 principles to make a killing in the stock market. These kinds of ideas, of course, those are exaggerations, but the focus of the gospel is on what God is going to do for me according to my own fleshly dreams. Then there's the other attenuated gospel, still within conservative ranks of the ticket to heaven. I became a Christian. The Holy Spirit has punched my ticket. I'll go on now to live in the world's playground until God calls me home, and I'll present my ticket and get into heaven. On the progressive side, we'll get into that, but the same sort of idea that we've failed to get the gospel right because we've failed to listen to our ancestors of the faith who have left for us such a rich heritage to keep us from going off the rails. I discovered early on in my faith journey that the American Christian world is often a world of apathy. There's no passion for discipleship. There's no passion for evangelism. There's no passion for truth. Is that God wanting to say something? I became a Christian by spending time with a group of believers. I saw something different in their lives. Turned out they were Baptists. And I still remember the first Sunday I went with this group. I was a visitor in the community and attended church. I didn't know the rules. I didn't know how you're supposed to act as a Christian. I learned very quickly that when that plate went by, you didn't take money out. I didn't have any money to put in, but you didn't take any out. But I learned later that I was at heart a reformed thinking Christian, because for me, the proclamation of the word was the center of the service. And I remember after that first service that I went to as a Christian, we went out afterwards as a group to Arby's. And I was so eager to ask questions about the pastor's message and the text, and to investigate how to make better sense of that message for my growth as a new believer. But since I was so new, I held my tongue and waited for someone else to bring up the message of the morning. And nobody did. Talked about who was dating whom, latest gossip on what was happening at the college, all sorts of subjects. And finally I said, hey, could someone help me understand what the pastor meant about such and such? And so that lasted about 15 seconds. And then it was back to more gossip. The day had moved on. So I learned very quickly the reality that you go to church, you hear a message, and then you can forget it. You don't need to carry that with you at all. I've seen that consistently in my own congregation, where people often by the end of the closing hymn have already forgotten the message. They're ready to move on. Except if they want to roast the preacher over their lunch or something, they'll remember those kinds of things. But we've seemed to wrongly inculcate in our people a sense that the hearing of the word and responding to the word is a fleeting moment in our overall lives. And this has led to not just apathy, but ignorance. I would venture to guess that if you asked the average person in the pew if they know of the Book of Confessions or have spent much time in it, they would say no, and they would ask you, well, is that a book of penitential prayers? What do you mean by confessions? We have such little understanding of our history. Laura and I were talking yesterday about confessional documents, and I mentioned having read recently the Belgic Confession and how much I liked it, and then said, I also really like the Canons of Dort. Well, if you asked a person in the pew what they thought of the Canons of Dort, they might say to you, why are you talking about war equipment? And in Holland, no less. We could stay right here here in the U.S. and find a lot of howitzers and everything. You don't need to go over to Dordrecht and look at cannons there. And you say, no, this is cannon with one N. And they say, well, those Europeans, they don't know how to spell anyway. Or as we'd say in Oklahoma, they can't spell American. But in 1984, I'd been a pastor for 2 years. I was up in Wyoming. At that time, all of Wyoming was one presbytery, so we were adequately safe from one another because we were at such great distances. And I didn't learn much about presbytery life and the lack of theological discourse until in 1984. All of the presbyteries were voting on amendments, and one of the things to vote on was a statement by the General Assembly on capital punishment. And we'd gotten this little booklet in the mail, and I thought, okay, I better look at it. So I read it pretty carefully, and I was just stunned by the vapid theology within it, and serpentine logic, and disconcerting grammar. And so I put together a little response because I thought, well, we're going to discuss this at the presbytery meeting along with all the other amendments. And so came time, and this was presented as one of the things to vote on, and I waited till nobody else got up, so I got up and I laid out why I thought this was really a poor document, and that the presbytery should not pass it. It needed a lot more work, a lot more biblical input into it. So I sat down, the vote was taken, passed. But during a break, one of my pastor friends came up to me and said, "Wow, you actually read that?" I said, "Yeah, weren't we supposed to?" Well, I since learned that we don't take theological discussion and interaction all that seriously. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, but whatever the reasons, I think it's fair to say that those who have been in mainline churches, and I can only speak from experience in the PCUSA, we have been unconsciously trained, if you've been in long enough, to not expect to engage theologically in church gatherings. It may be that we've had enough experience of frustration in attempting to do that has led us to despair, and so we just keep our mouths shut rather than to find further frustration. It may be out of apathy. We figure nobody else is interested any longer in discussing these things, so why should we even try? But for me, I think a lot of it has been, after a number of attempts, realizing that I was out of step with where most of the other pastors and elders seemed to be, and so if I opened my mouth, I was afraid of ridicule or of displeasing my compatriots. I think most all of us have had this experience of being in Presbyterian meetings where candidates are being examined. And you've read the candidate statement, and you may have found 3 things that you would like to ask about. This has happened to me on a number of occasions. So when the examination begins, they ask if anyone has questions. Of course, nobody typically stands up right away unless they're planted by CPM. But if you stand up and you say, "Well, I've got 3 questions," and the first is this: I noticed throughout your statement that you never once made a reference to anything dealing with election or predestination. Could you share your understanding from a Reformed perspective of what these doctrines mean in the life of the believer? And then you wait. And the candidate typically stumbles through something, but you look around and you see some of the elders and other pastors rolling their eyes saying, "Why would you ask a question like that?" And then the person finishes and you're ready to launch into your second question, and the moderator says, "Well, let me recognize this person over here," and you say, "Wait a minute, I've got 2 more questions." "Well, we'll get back to you if we have time." And the next person then stands up and says, "Well, would you mind telling me what your favorite costume was as a child when you were in nativity plays?" "Oh, well, I really liked being the starfish." "Wonderful, thank you very much. I move that the examination be arrested." Maybe that's not happened to you. But we've all been immersed in a denominational culture with habit patterns that we now, in this new denomination, need to break. We need to be conscious of them in order to divest ourselves of them. It seems to me that the mainline church across the board in this country has gotten 2 things backwards. We're called as churches to focus on our message and our mission, and then to figure out what methodology we use to accomplish our mission and make sure the message is understood. The message and the mission are meant to be constant, unchanging, steadfast, enduring. The methodology, on the other hand, is something that is meant to change in order to fit with the changing realities of the world. And so we want to look for something or methodologies that are innovative, that are fresh, that are novel. It seems to me that oftentimes we reverse those, and we're seeing that happen in many of the mainline denominations, that we want to continue to practice church in the same way. That's what's becoming constant. But we're jettisoning the message and the mission, or we're recalibrating those, and we're making those fresh or novel. You may have read recently, John Buchanan, now retired, was the senior pastor of Fourth Presbyterian Church for 26 years, probably the flagship progressive church in the PCUSA. John still serves as the editor, publisher of Christian Century. He was in Tulsa on Sunday giving a lecture. It was covered by the Tulsa World. John has made it pretty clear by his comments that he is a fan, if not acolyte, of Phyllis Tickle, and her viewpoint that every 500 years or so, the church universal, or the church, not universal, but in this world, undergoes some kind of huge shift, earthquake, within the life of God's people. The way Buchanan speaks of it is every 500 years or so, we undergo the equivalent of a rummage sale. I found that very interesting language. He was quoted as saying, things that are old and worn out get sold to make room for new things. So he said, we're due. Now, I can understand that if you're talking about methodologies, and he was talking to some degree about the methods of how we live out our calling as a church. But he also said, I think we're in the middle of a rummage sale. We're trying to figure out what comes next. And then in the course of the interview, the issues that he raised as to what comes next had to do with same-sex marriage and interfaith dialogue, where he said, one of our problems is that we've been trying to tell others that we're right and you're wrong. And he said, you can't do interfaith dialogue that way. We're not to seek truth. Well, those weren't his words. We're not to seek truth, but we are to find common good. And that common good, or that common ground, is what can unite us over against our differences. So right now we're in a rummage sale. We may have to sell off some of our beliefs which don't quite fit the world around us today. And so in the progressive world, we see an attenuated gospel as well. A gospel that seeks to pursue justice, love, and to seek peace at almost any cost, and forgets the heart of the gospel message. So for those of us who are ECO attendees here and who are concerned about the role that theological discernment and engagement will have within our denomination, there are two vital tasks that lie before us. And both these tasks demand grassroots generated involvement. The first is the permanent selection of our confessional standards, however that takes shape. We will have to decide that as a body together. As Laura mentioned, this can't be a top-down appointed decision. It's something that has to rise up out of the heart of God's people under the influence and movement of the Holy Spirit. And the second, equally important, perhaps even more important, is we need to build into our inherited DNA from the PCUSA, new genes, which will keep the creeds and confessions in the heart of our communal life. It's wonderful. The book of Confessions, I think, is a wonderful collection of documents. But it's useless if it isn't actually integrated into the life of the church. So if I had to choose between these two priorities as to which one I would work on first, I would work on the process. I would try to answer the question. I think we need to answer this question within our own churches, with our sessions, within our presbyteries, and as a synod. What kinds of activities are we going to engage in? What kinds of processes are we going to follow to make sure that our confessions, whatever they turn out to be finally, our grouping of confessions and creeds, won't simply be, as John was saying, window dressing? Well, I think of it a little bit differently. I think of the zoo of ideas, and that the creeds are like different animals in the zoo. We come to visit the zoo. We see those animals in their native habitat behind 2 inches of plexiglass. We view them and we're happy to see them. And then we leave the zoo and we forget about them. And we go back into our real world life with little thought about our particular creeds and confessions and how they should impact our behaviors individually and as brothers and sisters together. So the questions that arise before us are how to exorcise the demons of apathy and of distrust that we have inherited, and of fear. Sometimes we worry that we may be too theologically minded to be any ecclesially good. But that really, I think, is a false fear. Because if we are truly grounded theologically in our Reformed heritage, we'll be able to sort out what is of fundamental importance in the life of the church and what is secondary. One of the big issues before us in a fledgling denomination, 277 churches or so now spanning the United States, how do we overcome the barriers of time and space in order to be able to build relationships deeply enough that we are willing then to trust one another with our future together, with our jointly held theology? How do we reshape our sessions, our presbyteries, and our synod gatherings to match our priorities? I love some of the suggestions in the Q&A time that John was giving about preaching maybe in a stealth mode, but preaching through Heidelberg or the Westminster Standards. That's convicting to me. What a great way to integrate our heritage into the lives of our congregations. We do want, as our website says, to be innovative, entrepreneurial in our methods. But what does it profit the church to gain market share if she loses her message or her soul? How do we go about training up new leaders who have cut their teeth on our creeds and confessions? How do we work that into our examination of candidates? How do we take our gatekeeping responsibilities seriously, graciously, but without apology? These are all elements that we as God's people together in this denomination need to work out in practice together. I've always had a great interest in the religion of Islam. I grew up in the Middle East to a secular Muslim father and was surrounded by very conservative Wahhabi Islam for most of my youth and teen years. So it's rare that I don't compare and contrast what happens among God's people with what takes place in Islam. I never had thought about this before, but as I was thinking about what it means for us to be a confessional, creedal people, I also thought about Islam, which is a non-creedal faith. We believe that God, in His love, structured through His truth, unifies us through the Spirit that He has sent to indwell His people. In Islam, there's no supernatural glue that holds the community together, and indeed there's no creedal statement other than the Shahada. There is but one God, and Muhammad is His prophet. That's not much to build on. So what holds a religion like Islam together? It's three things, I think. It's an authoritarian structure. It's the Sharia law. And it's the ritual, the 5 pillars that every Muslim is required to practice. Now, those things don't translate over into a Reformed perspective. Presbyterians don't do well with an authoritarian structure. We've learned that our sinful natures, when mixed together with power, tend to do bad things. And so we like this division of powers, checks and balances. So we're not up for a reformed pope, so to speak. We're also people of grace, not people of laws. So we have law, as John was saying earlier, but our lives are not regulated by obedience to laws. Instead, we are moved, compelled by the love of Christ to obedience. And lastly, although there certainly are rituals within the Christian faith and within the Reformed circle of the Christian faith, we do not have practices that every Christian is mandated to do on a daily basis at the same time and in the same way. We are not unified by ritual in the same way that the Muslim world is. What will lead us as a new denomination to respond faithfully to God in this world and to demonstrate the unity of the body? Well, I'm sure lots of answers to that. But one, at least, is that we must be committed together to pursuing His truth, to developing deeper understandings of the faith once for all delivered to the saints. We can do that best as we stand on the shoulders of the giants of the faith of yesteryear. and we hinder the work, we harm the body when we don't take seriously the work of the mind and seeking to integrate the truth of God into all that we do. So the challenge for us as we go into small groups is to seek to answer these practical questions. What's next? How will we go about putting together plans, processes for our Reformed heritage to soak more deeply into the lives of the people in the pews, not just the leaders? And then how will we as a denomination come to a decision on what will be our ultimate frame of reference with regard to our creeds and confessions? Lots of work to do, but I'm grateful to see 120 some folks who are passionate about theology and the desire to see God glorified in our midst. Amen.